You're listening to Middle East expert and keynote speaker Neil Lazarus, live from Jerusalem.
So welcome to another podcast. Jonathan, thank you for joining us in the UK. And today we're talking about Christians supporting Israel. So tell me, why should we so be happy that so many Christians and the Christian movement are supporting Israel when effectively it's increasing Israel's connection between the far right, homophobic beliefs, Trump, and conservatism, where the battle really is being lost with Israel and liberal America in particular? I know you're talking from the UK, but the battle really is in the States.
So first of all, thank you for having me on. And second, what a question to start. So I would first begin by saying you're right in the sense that the debate that exists about Christian Zionism today is very much an American conversation, an American-Israeli conversation. But I would like to start off that it was, British Christian Zionism, that it was, at the start of the Balfour Declaration and in that period, that really had the biggest influence in first setting up the state of Israel, or at least encouraging the settlement of Jews into Palestine. And of course, it was called this great enterprise. And many of the British members of the aristocracy, of the upper class, who took this view that it was a matter of justice that the Jewish people had a place to call home, and that they would have that home in this specific plot of land, came from, I think, a very sincere, genuine reading of the Christian scriptures, or the Bible, both the Old Testament scriptures and the New Testament, is really a product, I think, of developments that happened after the State of Israel was founded. And I think there needs to be a separation of the discussion from sort of the biblical nature of Christian support for Israel and how that has been has evolved into this different animal that we see as being the biggest influence now in terms of Israel today.
But I hear what you're saying, but the reality is, if we talk about certainly today, we can't really try and guess what the agenda was for those people supporting the Balfour Declaration. And there are issues of supporting British imperialism, so on and so forth. But the reality is today, the Christians for Israel organizations are pretty right-wing. They seem to have an agenda which is linked into Revelations, that they want Jews to come to hasten the coming of the end of days. All a bit dodgy, as you would say in the UK.
I think there are, you're right to say that those are reasons. I think there are multiple reasons, and we need to kind of pick them apart why Christians would support Israel. First of all, Christians identify, or Christians that are involved in the Israel conversation, and this was my personal involvement in this. It came from this position, was a concern about the Christian community in the Middle East and the wider experiences of the persecuted Christian communities in the Middle East. And that stems from the core belief and the core view, which is part of our faith and our experiences, that our faith was a Middle Eastern religion.
But you've got Christian Palestinians in what's called the Kairos document. And
Right.
There are other organizations who are saying, hey, we're Christians, we're Palestinians, and Christians around the world shouldn't be supporting occupation. That if we believe in Jesus, if we believe not only in the written word, but in the spirit of Jesus, then that has to be of one of compassion, of one of favoring, if you like, the meek, the underdog, and that's the Palestinians. So from a Christian perspective, although you may be able to quote scriptures, the reality is, if Jesus is seen as the spirit of Jesus is still meant to be here, then how could you support occupation and a right-wing Netanyahu government?
Right. It's a very important question, because the divide about the role of Christians involved in the discussion about the experience of the Palestinians is very much a generational thing. So Christian Zionists who are of the generation that saw the state of Israel founded are stuck in sort of this moment of euphoria of seeing the state of Israel founded. And many, as I've been told, were listening to the radio, the news of Israel being founded and the Declaration of Independence, and looking at...
I mean, that's interesting, but like, I'm talking about today. I mean,
No, right. So I'm going to progress into then how that relates to 21st century developments, because what you have of my generation, you have exactly that criticism. And the reason why most Christian Zionism now is of an older generation is because that conversation that really took to such a degree of, it's all about Israel, it's all about celebrating Zionism and the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, which is fantastic. But the conversation is no longer about whether the Jews have the right to self-determination, at least in Christian Zionist circles. The question is now, what is the right Christian response towards the Palestinians?
Well, that's the debate, because if you have...
That's the debate. And there are a number of different Christian organizations, Neil, that are emerging out of this divide of saying we actually do not accept the Christian Zionism of our grandparents' generation, to the extent that we believe that there is an urgent Christian call to respond to the need and compassion on behalf of the Palestinians. And it's about getting the right, I won't say balance, because that assumes that, you know, there's a balance between two injustices. It's about having the right attitude towards the people in the land. And that means ensuring...
Let me, if I can interject for a second. Let me quote you something. It says, and this is from the Kairos document,
right.
The mission of the church is prophetic, to speak the word of God courageously, honestly and lovingly, in the local context, in the midst of daily events. If she does take sides, it will be with the oppressed, to stand alongside them, just as Christ our Lord stood by the side of each poor person.
Right.
Convince me otherwise.
I'm not here to convince you otherwise, because I don't think that in that statement that you quoted there's anything particularly wrong with that. But what I will say, what I know about the
How do you not support the oppressed?
So let me tell you. So Jesus tells a parable, and you know this is your fault if you accuse me of preaching to you, Neil. But I'll use this example because it's the example of Christian compassion that I think is the right response and the right relationship that Christians should have to the people in the land, regardless of whether they're Jew or Palestinian. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. I won't talk all about it, but essentially there was one man who was walking along the road from Jerusalem to Jericho and was beaten up by a gang of robbers. And Jesus is telling this parable in response to the question, you know, who will inherit the kingdom of God? And he is, and the person who asked the questions, a lawyer, says, in response to Jesus that, to do that, you need to love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. And then the lawyer says, well, who is my neighbor? So Jesus tells this parable. And at the end of the parable, which essentially is the story of a man giving up everything to help a stranger who is stranded and beaten up and left for dead, and goes to such great extents to serve that person in compassion, to provide for their care and to bandage up their wounds and so on. And at the end of that parable, you can find in the book of Luke, in one of the Gospels in the New Testament, and Jesus says, after telling this parable, who was the neighbor to him in this story? And there were obviously in the parable of the Good Samaritan, there was a number of people that walked on past this individual.
I understand. Okay, but the issue is as follows. First of all, I mean, we can argue about that. For example, the question of whether the kingdom of is really a kingdom on earth or a kingdom which is
no, but that's not the point of the parable. If I may finish, it's not the point of the parable.
Believe me, everyone switched off because they're now raising another issue which we have, which is, hold on, isn't the Christian agenda for supporting Israel, one, conversion of Jews, two, hoping the Jews will come to the promised land to hasten the coming of the Messiah? And when Messiah comes, we're all going to be Christian. So I'm kind of a bit worried.
To first say, of any faith that numbers billions and billions in the world, maybe not billions and billions, but maybe a billion, that there is not, and as much as there's, what's the phrase, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, there's much the same when it comes to the topic within Christian circles around Israel and the Jewish people. There is no denying that there's some people whose entire lives are dedicated to the project of proselytizing and conversion and reduce their Christianity and their faith down to that aim. And many will take their view of the Jewish people and apply that same rule as they would apply to anybody else. But the reality is that Christianity is far broader and the teachings far more impactful than simply about that question of the only things Christians should be doing is going around and proselytizing. And that means understanding what
so Revelations isn't relevant for most people.
In terms of actually the majority of mainstream evangelical Christianity, and I'm not here to say whether that's wrong or right, but it's not part of the conversation. There will be people who are Christian Zionists who would say, actually, it really should be part of the conversation, and many Christian Zionists actually find themselves outside the mainstream of the church because the church does not teach about Revelation. It doesn't teach or have any consideration or any particular concern.
So you're saying Revelation is marginal? The concept of revelation is
within the conversation of the modern day evangelical church, absolutely.
Okay, so I feel less worried.
Absolutely.
How did you get into this
then? First, my parents were both involved in, if we can call it, the sphere of Christian advocacy. That's not what they call it, but it will be the most easily relatable to
the sphere of Christian advocacy. There's
both my parents supported persecuted Christians and volunteered in a personal capacity to support persecuted Christians at various places. My dad in former Soviet Union and my mum also in the former Soviet Union. But my mum actually revisited this passion of hers in 2011 in Cairo, around the time of the Arab Spring. It might have been 2011, maybe 2012, 13. But she visited Cairo and she came back so enthused by the things she learned about the wonderful blessing it was for her to be able to support persecuted Christians there. She had a map that she put on her study, and it was a color-coded map of the countries across the world that persecuted Christians the most. So it was color-coded, so you had a red for severe persecution, amber, green, and so on. All across the Middle East, there was a sea of red. Bang on in the middle of this little sea of red was a little green dot. And I asked my mum, I said, what's that dot? And she said, oh, that's Israel. And that was my first sort of, I guess you can say, seed that was planted in my head about there's something unique about this country, Israel, in terms of its relationship to people of my faith and people that I identify with.
How do you find being active in England? People deal with you? Is it with suspicion?
Depends who that person is. To be honest,
community, the Jewish community in the UK.
My experience in the Jewish community has been extremely welcoming. And I think it's because the truth of my story begins first with a concern about anti-Semitism, a concern about my personal experiences on campus, where the way the Israel conversation was handled was so vicious and so concerning that my desire to get involved didn't stem from any prior biblical or religious or spiritual or theological convictions, but it stemmed from a concern to respond to the very clear need of correcting the misinformation that existed about Israel on campus and supporting Jewish students to be able to have that conversation. For many, they were reduced to being silenced over the violence and the viciousness of the way that the discussion was handled. And so when I tell that story, I'm very much welcomed with open arms. And because I am an ally, and I think the Jewish community does see me as an ally, and I see myself as an ally in that fight of educating people about Israel, correcting the misinformation, and ensuring that we combat anti-Semitism, which so often now does occur within those anti-Zionist discussions. And it is a new form, very much so, I think, of anti-Semitism, and we need to be aware of it, and that's the basis in which I find myself working within the Jewish community.
The concept of Jews as the promised people is being replaced within mainstream Christianity with a replacement theory. Is that a major problem within the UK?
I would say the view, which is called replacement theology, which is historical, and I won't go into it too much, but it is a historical legacy that has impacted the church in this way, in that it has caused an apathy or an unwillingness or a disengagement from questions over what is the continual role, if any, of the Jewish people from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Of course, Christians have the Old Testament scriptures and the New Testament scriptures, and very much the replacement theology view takes a privileged view of the New Testament and says, well, the revelation of the New Testament, of Jesus, replaces, therefore, the Old Testament revelation. And what that means is because in the Old Testament, this is what they would say, you have the Jewish people who are chosen. In the New Testament, it's the church. And the church is made up of all people, regardless of their ethnic or cultural background, who believe Jesus Christ as the Messiah. And so they take the view, therefore, that there is this new body, the church.
What happens when the Messiah comes? What happens to the Jews in the Holy Land?
That's a good question, and there's enough.
That is a good question. Answer it.
I don't have the answer, and that's the humble and honest opinion. Because these, well, first of all,
I thought it was we were all going to become Christian.
Honestly, I don't know the answer to that. I honestly don't know. I thought
that's why your evangelical Christians like Jews to make Aliyah, so it would hasten the process of Messiah. And at that time, Messiah will, the Jews will follow Messiah. And the one thing that I do know about the Christian belief connected to this issue is, of course, the belief, and this connects to the questions over settlements and questions over occupation and all those sort of terminology, is that in order for Christ to come back, so they posit, the Jewish people have to be back in the land of Israel, and they have to particularly be in sovereign control over Jerusalem, because they believe that Jesus will return to the same mountain in the way that he... There's a bit of an agenda going on over here.
There's an agenda. Everybody's got an agenda.
So you're not denying it?
Agenda. Well, I think everybody has an agenda. It's not necessarily a good one, or it's not necessarily a bad one. What we should be doing, and I think is the mature thing to do, is trying to understand the reasons why different Christians support Israel, and they're not going to be the same. But in the same way, many Jewish people, especially the Jewish people, have very different agendas as to why they support Israel, or how they support Israel, or how they understand their relationship to the question of supporting Israel. My understanding, my self-understanding of how and why I support Israel is very, very different from many of the people that you are talking about, and that's because of a different context, a different...
in British Jewry, how many people represent your opinion? How many are evangelical?
Would you mean
British Jewry in Britain? You remember that country which is disappearing quickly?
I think so. First of all, and I don't mean this to make myself to puff myself up, but I'm unique in the sense that I'm strange. Unique, not in a positive.
We know that.
It depends who you speak to. Unique in the sense that most Christians are not conscious or caring about Israel, whether from a spiritual, biblical, or even political perspective. And that goes very much the same for the church. I think there is an increasing number of Christians worldwide, in America too, that, like me, are wanting to have a different conversation from the conversation that our parents and grandparents have about Israel. And that means having a Christian Zionist belief, or a right Christian relationship to Israel that affirms the inherent justice of the right of the Jewish people to have self-determination in their historical homeland, but also recognizes that there are blatant injustices that exist within the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict, both historically and in the contemporary here and now, and that a right Christian response is not to ignore those things, but to engage them in a way that does not exclude either community. And by those communities, I mean the Jewish community nor the Arab-Palestinian community. And I think the young people, young Christians, are very much aware of that story and that change, and are looking for something different in contrast to the kind of conversation that happened in generations previous.
Thank you very much for joining us. It was an interesting conversation.
Neil Lazarus' awesome seminars are educating, motivating, and challenging. Why not book a seminar today via his website, awesomeseminars.com.